I know Matt loves the lyrics on the title track.
Something about those lyrics, man. Oof.
We came out rocking with Rhonda and Barbara Ann.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, my name is Jake, and welcome to the 33rd episode of Good Timin. As always on this podcast, we're going to be talking about one of our favorite bands, the Beach Boys. And today we've got a pretty fun show in store for you all, as we're going to be doing our third member spotlight episode, which is where we focus in on a specific member of the band and discuss their life and musical career. So, as I'm sure you could all tell from the title of this video, today we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite frontman, Mr. Michael Edward Love, or as some call him, Dr. Love. Mike, of course, is one of the founding members of the Beach Boys and has contributed to all 29 of their studio albums from 1962 to 2012. He also has arguably the most distinctive voice in the band, and that voice can be heard on dozens of the band's early hits, many of which he also co-wrote with Brian. Mike, of course, has also collaborated with most of the other members of the band over the years, most notably Al, and he's even contributed his own solo tracks every once in a while to varying degrees of success. So, yeah, Mike has had a very long and interesting life, both on and off the stage. Of course, it hasn't been without some controversy along the way. But like him or not, there's no doubt that he played a huge role in the band's early sound and has also made a lot of great contributions to the group over the years, both vocally and lyrically. So joining me for today's episode, we have our usual Noble Surfer Matt, as well as our unofficial fourth member, Nate. So as always, I'm happy to have you guys here, and I'm looking forward to talking about Mick Jagger's favorite frontman with you all. So before we begin, do you guys have any quick general thoughts or things that you wanted to say about Mike and his role in the Beach Boys?
So I just go, well, I'll be totally honest. When I first got into this group 6 years ago, I was very much in the fuck Mike Love camp, and he's like the worst man that ever lived. After doing more research, I've softened my stance on that. I think, yes, he's done some unsavourable things. Yes, he's kind of an ass sometimes, but he's our ass. I know that's like a joke that we say in the fandom. But I really think that, truthfully, I don't know if this group would have been as big as they were in the early days, because I think that, he had the chutzpah and the charisma to get up there and really be the front man, because we all know Brian never really wanted to do that. Carl was young. Dennis was stuck behind drums. David really couldn't sing that well. So, you kind of had to have Mike there. And I think that he's written so many great songs, both with Brian and without Brian, that I think that it would be a tragedy if we didn't have them in the catalog. So I'm a lot more neutral on him now. I still, he's definitely never been my favorite member and probably never will, but I appreciate what he has brought to the band over the years. So I'm definitely not, screw him anymore.
Well, that's a good evolution. I'm happy to hear that you made that evolution in your thought process. And I would just say, to start us off with, is that I've said it before, and I also think the recent Disney movie did a good job putting this in perspective. But to me, the core essence of the Beach Boys is Brian's production and compositional and arrangement skills, combined with, essentially, the way I'd put it is Mike's world view, like Mike's lyrics, Mike's concepts for packaging, Mike's concepts for touring. You put the way that Mike looked at life and looked at the business together with Brian's amazing arrangements and productions, and you had magic, and that magic still works to this very day. So thank God for Mike, because he's the sole member that never quit the group. Every other member of the band left for some reason or another at some point, and Mike is the only one that is the through line. And to this day, he's still out there performing these songs almost every night, and it's just a testament to, no pun intended, if you do what you love, it's not a job. So I think Mike is a great personification of that.
Yeah, I pretty much echo everything that you guys said. I'll keep it brief, but I'm with Matt. Definitely, like when I first got into this band, I definitely kind of viewed Mike in a more negative way. Like I kind of, you hear what other people say about him, and you hear all these stories and all these things that have happened over the years, and you kind of paint like a negative image in your head. But like Matt, over time, my image on him has softened. He certainly has contributed a lot of great stuff to the band, both as a vocalist and as a lyricist, and also obviously has co-written some amazing songs as well. And yeah, I mean, Mike really, I feel like his lyrics, like you kind of said, Nate, really kind of like shaped the band's image, like the themes that the band would become known for with surfing, cars, girls. I feel like Mike's lyrics really painted that early picture that really defined the band's early years. So, yeah, I mean, Mike has been there since the very start. Like I mentioned at the start, he's been on like every single studio album that they ever did. And he's made so many amazing contributions over the years. So, yes, there's some problematic things that he said and done over the years. But today we're going to be focusing more on highlighting the positive aspects of Mike's life and talking about some of the amazing musical contributions that he's made to the band. So I'm looking forward to this episode and talking all about Mike Love. So. So to start us off, Nate, do you kind of want to go into Mike's early years before the Beach Boys had officially formed, and how he eventually became one of the founding members of the band?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Mike was born in 1941 and by most accounts had what most would consider like the fairly quintessential American childhood. To sum it up briefly, he and his parents were the descendants of immigrants that had moved from Scandinavia to California for a better life. And Mike's dad actually did, somewhat well. And so Mike grew up in a big house with his brothers and sisters. And the reason I even mention all that is to say that they had their whole music set up in the house with a piano and an organ and a harp and guitars. And so all of Mike and his siblings, they would sing and play instruments. And just like the Wilsons, they were a very musical family. So you can already see the foundation that set for the Beach Boys to happen eventually. So Mike's sister, Maureen, played the harp, and she would eventually go on to play harp on quite a number of Beach Boys songs. So just a very musical family. And we all know that during the holiday times, the Wilsons and the Loves would get together and sing Christmas carols. And Mike remembers that as the earliest example of the guys that would go on to become the Beach Boys singing together at these family parties. So Mike not only had a musical background through his family, singing a lot of religious music and standards, but he was also a huge fan of R&B. He liked, a lot of the doo-wop stuff, like the Flamingos and, the Coasters, and he was into more of the rock and roll, like Little Richard, and particularly Chuck Berry, who was probably without a doubt the biggest influence on Mike as a songwriter. And later on, he was particularly motivated by Jane and Dean because he recognized that they were local guys about the same age as them. And he caught wind through the grapevine that they were making music in their garage. And he sort of thought and remembered saying, if they can do it, so can we. So I think there were a lot of musical influences going on in Mike's life. And of course, he and Brian, from a young age, teenage years, they would walk home from church or walk home from school together and sing Everly Brothers harmonies or Four Freshmen harmonies on their way home. So Brian and Mike had that tight musical bond that predated the Beach Boys, completely.
Yeah, something interesting to me, like you mentioned, Nate, is like, yeah, Mike's role on kind of shaping the band's early sound with like the doo-wop influence, like you said. I remember reading a quote where Carl said that Mike played a big role in actually like kind of influencing some of those doo-wop style arrangements that the band would do on some of their earlier recordings. And I know that Mike is supposedly the one that really got Brian into listening to like black R&B records early on, which is which I mean, if Brian hadn't been introduced to that, who knows what would have happened with the Beach Boys, what they would have sounded like. So I feel like, yeah, Mike played a big role in getting Brian into that music.
I think it's really interesting that you could basically make the argument that each of the five founding members played a pivotal role
Mm-hmm.
in the band being started. And, to go down the list, obviously Dennis suggested writing the surfing song, which,
Mm-hmm.
clearly there you go.
Yeah.
Carl is the guy that kind of brought the guitars into the fold before it was all the a cappella stuff. And Carl was the one that inserted that rock and roll. Al and Brian were really the ones that were interested in starting a group. They had been talking about putting a band together for some time since they played football together.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing is all of those guys, it came out of like a hobby or a passion. And that's not to say that music wasn't a hobby or a passion for Mike. But the interesting thing about Mike's situation that set him apart from all the others is the others wanted it, but Mike basically needed it
Mm-hmm. Right.
because
Mhm.
yeah, so he had a kid on the way and his first marriage happening, and whereas the other guys were still in school and still basically kids, Mike was entering adulthood and needed a way to provide for his family. So I think that gave Mike probably an extra boost of motivation to get their group off the ground. One thing I would add too, real quick, before it slips my mind, is that around this time, actually, how I mentioned that Mike's dad did quite well and they had a big house and all that. Mike's dad's business went south around the time of the Beach Boys forming. And so Mike basically saw his dad at the, top of the economic ladder and then, completely bankrupt, having to sell most of their belongings. And I think that really scarred slash motivated Mike, never to be in that situation again. And it's easy when you look at the Beach Boys story and Mike's story to sometimes wonder why Mike has treated everything like a business and why it's always been about the bottom line with him. But when remember that he was scarred by seeing his dad go from comfort to, having nothing, he never wanted to put that situation upon his family again. So it sort of fills in that picture a little bit.
Yeah, but I also think that because he is so business minded, that made him the target among not only other musicians, but also people in the media. There is an infamous article out there that says he's worse than like Steve Albini, Morrissey, Liam Gallagher, and Billy Corgan all put together. Those are pretty harsh words, I think, to be honest with you. I mean, and I think you make a really good point that I think unfortunately because he's so not unfortunately, but because he was so business minded, put a target on the back because it's
Yeah,
art for art's sake, like the myth and the love of like the starving artist, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
yeah, I was gonna save this for when we got into the 90s, but since you brought it up, I think it's really for the most part going away, but in the late 90s, 2000s, kind of around the reunion time, it literally seemed like there was like a media agenda to make Mike seem like a douchebag. And I'm not saying Mike didn't do things that made it deserved, but there was like a literal like movement of articles coming out in well-known magazines, like literally straight up disparaging Mike. Um, and I do think part of the reason that happened was that, like we were saying, Mike was really business oriented. And I think a lot of artists play ball with the industry because they, like you said, they just care about art for art's sake. And
Mm-hmm.
so they'll take really shitty contracts and they'll take pennies on the dollar and they'll let themselves get screwed over basically. And by the time the whole Capitol fiasco ended, Mike was a lot more business savvy. And I think he would really give the labels and the promoters and a lot of people involved with the business hell to make sure the Beach Boys were coming out on top and coming out secure on the business end of things. And that could have burned a lot of bridges that would later on in life sort of create that media movement where you see all these articles about him.
Yeah.
Because those memories and those relationships and those people still live on and still work in the industry, so you could see how those things would circle back around.
Yeah, and I also think that I think it was 1971, that Rolling Stone article that kind of painted him as like the destroyer of smile, I think also kind of did a big number because Rolling Stone used to be super influential in shaping public narratives about a lot of art.
Yeah,
I mean, look at Paul McCartney, Jake. People like
I was
critics
gonna say
for
yeah.
years because Jan Wenner had a vendetta against him, and it all started with Rolling Stone. So like I think that might have also done a big number on it. I just want to add one thing too, Nate. Going back to what you were saying about like that each of the five members kind of brought something to the group. I agree with that, and I also think that also you can hear that in the style, in the sound too. Whereas like Mike brought in the R&B, um, Carl brought in like the Chuck Berry.
Yeah.
Ryan brought in the Four Freshmen, Al brought in Kingston Trio, and then Dennis would bring in things like Dion and the Belmonts and all that kind of stuff because he loved those like teen idols.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
All right, so now as we kind of start to get more into like discussing some of like the band's early music and some of Mike's contributions, Nate, do you kind of want to talk about some of like Brian's earliest collaborations working with Mike and just kind of like how the pair would write together during the band's early years?
Yeah, so the legend goes, and I think people would probably debate like the validity of the tale, but the way the story goes is that the Height Morgan and his wife thought the boys were great singers and all that, but that they would get nowhere by covering old standards and that they needed to write their own material. Here comes Dennis saying that they had a surf song, and now it was Mike and Brian's job to write the song. So surfing, and I think Mike has admitted this many times, was like directly inspired by what Jane and Dean had been doing, particularly songs like Jenny Lee and Baby Talk with the bops and the dip-a-dips. That was like very much Jane and Dean's shtick. And so right off the bat, surfing just has that Beach Boys magic right away. Like it has, of course, the harmonies and the cool guitar playing, but like from the very first song, Mike's lyrics paint such a cool picture of that, California lifestyle. And I can imagine that with songs like Surfing, probably Fun, 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 I Get Around, any of those songs with Mike leads that have that Chuck Berry influenced rhythm and intonation to the vocals, I'm sort of led to believe that Mike probably crafted those vocal melodies either with Brian or just with, you can imagine Brian sitting at the piano and doing the oohs and the ahs and starting to sketch out the harmonic ideas. And you can see Mike going, got up this morning, turn on my, you can just picture that being sort of the way the songs would come about. And obviously, with these very jazz inspired melodies like Warmth of the Sun or In the Back of My Mind, those are clearly Brian melodies. But I think a lot of these early rock and roll tunes have a certain Mike Love aspect to the melodies that you will see come up again on songs he wrote without Brian, like the hook on Kokomo, for example, has that R&B kind of Mike feel. So I think it's easy for Mike to get painted as like just the lyricist because there are so many writing partnerships that do work that way, like Burt Bacharach and Hal David, or Elton John and Bernie. Yep. There are a lot of relationships where it is that cut and dry. But I think with Mike and Brian, it probably was less cut and dry, probably a little bit closer to like a Lennon-McCartney type of situation, where even though Brian was the one coming up with the chords, I think Mike did have a lot of musical influence that maybe goes unrecognized. So right off the bat, they wrote, obviously, Surfing, but then the majority of their first few albums together, a lot of, of their biggest songs like Surfing Safari, 409, Catch a Wave, Hawaii.
Yeah. From those early albums that the band released, are there any particular songs that you guys wanted to highlight where like you feel like Mike delivers a really strong vocal or just some cool lyrical contributions?
Define first few, like up through what?
Well, up through like, let's say up through like Shutdown Volume 2.
Okay. On those early ones, I would say some of the car songs I think he does some really good vocal work on, like Shut Down and Little Deuce Coupe. He really sells those songs well. I've always been kind of fond of his vocal on Surfin' Safari just because of how raw it is and like the little bits and stuff. But yeah, I would just say like there's an attitude in his vocals that I think really helps sell a lot of the early material that I don't know if really anybody else would have been able to pull it off at that point in time in the group.
It's so true. Like the Beach Boys, it's such a core aspect of their sound, like you think about all of their biggest hits, or at least most of them, and Mike's, cutting nasal vocal is just such a signature part of the sound. And you have to imagine too, like the old listening technology, like shitty AM radios
Hmm.
or the little turntables that the kids had to listen to their 45s. I think Mike's voice cut through those mixes particularly well to the point where kids could actually hear the lyrics, like a lot of kids probably may have not even known what the hell the Beatles were saying, but Mike's vocals cut through the mix so clear with the way he sang that you could clearly visualize the images that the Beach Boys were painting through hearing Mike's lyrics and Mike singing the lyrics.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And especially like, yeah, like with all the distortion and everything that was inherent on that in those products though, like because of like the way he has really good enunciation. That's one thing he's really
Yeah,
like you can really hear what he's saying. Because sometimes there's certain artists that you try to listen to them and you don't even know what the hell they're saying because they like mumble half the words. Ariana Grande is
totally.
infamous for that.
Yeah. A few songs that I wanted to highlight from the band's first few albums. Obviously, Surfing Safari, like you mentioned, Matt, is a very memorable lead vocal. And like you said, one of those songs where it kind of has like your perfect little imperfections where the vocal's a little bit strained, but it almost adds to the charm of the recording.
Yeah.
Makes it a unique vocal for sure. I also really love Mike's bass vocals on The Lonely Sea from Surfing USA. I think that it really enhances kind of the haunting vibe that that song has, that really low bass voice from him. I think that sounds really cool. Obviously, we have to mention Mike's incredible sax solo on Shutdown, of course.
Oh yeah.
That's definitely a highlight there.
The famous
Um,
sax solo.
and then also Mike does on the song Finders Keepers from Surfing USA, he does his famous really low Finders Keepers,
Like,
that really low voice
yeah.
that he would bring out on songs like Louie Louie and I think Keeping the Summer Alive later on. So he has that real low, recognizable kind of doo-woppy voice, which he brings out from time to time. And then besides that, like Matt mentioned, some of the car songs are really great lead vocals, like Little Deuce Coupe in particular. I really love his vocal on that. And then of course you have like the iconic songs like Fun, 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 with not only an iconic vocal, but an iconic lyrics as well from Mike.
Yeah.
Um, really great lyrics there and just a really fun song, pun not intended. And yeah, just really from an early point, you can already hear like Mike's contributions in terms of like the lyrics of the songs and just the fun, catchy melodies. And definitely you can tell what a great partnership that him and Brian working together really was. So then in 1964, the Beach Boys release All Summer Long, which is one of their most cohesive albums up to that point. And Mike has some really notable contributions on this album, most notably I Get Around, where he delivers a really great lead vocal and some really great lyrics. Like you kind of said, Nate, they really paint a picture about like driving around town and picking up girls, and it's basically like that Beach Boys imagery that really came to define the band's early years. And you also see that on songs like All Summer Long from the album. Wendy, I think, has a really great vocal from Mike. I really love the way that he sings that song. And then the song Hushabye, I really love Mike's part, like the lullaby, and
Yeah.
really love his vocal on that. He sings that so well. So do you guys have any thoughts on some of Mike's contributions to the All Summer Long album?
I love the way he sings his parts on the title track where it's like, remember when you spilled Coke all over your
Yeah.
house? Like it kind of has that like wistfulness to it, I guess you could say. Like you're reflecting back on summers gone by.
Yeah.
Very like Wendy has a very like almost tortured vocal from him, I think. You know, like you can kind of hear the defeat in his voice. Hushabye, beautiful as you mentioned. Um, I think that you have like Drive In that's a little silly, but I think, you know, it's kind of cool to hear the humorous side of his voice, I guess. But yeah, no, and I think I Get Around obviously is one of the greatest songs ever, and a lot of that is because of not only the vocal from him, but also those lyrics. Like you said, he paints a really good picture with the words.
Yeah, something, you know, I Get Around when Brian had originally began writing it, just jumped right into the chorus. And it was Mike's suggestion to start it off with the a cappella Barbara Ann inspired hook, the round, round, get around, and that just instantly catches the listener's ear.
Mhm.
You could hear that, say you're downstairs, you could hear that from upstairs and instantly hear it, know what it is, and certain songs just have that magical quality where you instantly know what you're listening to. And I think that was one of Mike's big talents were those hooks. Um, So yeah, you guys obviously mentioned a lot of great tunes that he wrote and sang. So as far as the early years, I guess I would want to point out too a lot of we mentioned a lot of the upbeat hits, but he also wrote a lot of the ballads and deeper cuts. And
Hmm.
I think that some of the lyrics he contributed are either the most or on par with, other extremely touching Beach Boys lyrics. So some that come to mind for me would be The Warmth of the Sun,
Hmm.
Mhm.
Please Let Me Wonder,
Mhm.
In the Back of My Mind, songs that have really expressive lyrics that complemented Brian's music really well. And I think there's a notion that Brian wrote with guys like Tony Asher or Van Dyke because people think that Mike maybe wasn't capable of those really emotive lyrics. But I think clearly Mike was extremely capable of writing extremely touching lyrics with, I think The Warmth of the Sun maybe taking the cake for maybe I'd say maybe my favorite lyrics I've ever heard.
Yeah, those are very, very good lyrics. And I think that they express kind of that. I know that that was written in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. So I think
Yeah.
it
Hmm.
reflects where a lot of the youth in America felt at that time, a loss of innocence, a loss of optimism. Who knows where we're going from here? Another one I wanted to highlight on today, When I Grew Up to Be a Man. I think the vocal is great.
Yeah, great.
I think the lyrics are great too because he does a great job of kind of writing about the fear of growing up, the fear of changing your personality, the fear of the unknown. And I think that it's done very well. And I think honestly, like I would say pretty much the entire B side of today, the songs that he wrote with Brian are some of the finest in the catalog of the Beach Boys, and the lyrics are wonderful. And I think the thing about I think that at least when it comes to Van Dyke could write really like reflective stuff, but I also think like Van Dyke just really like the really like cut up style of lyrics that Mike always had.
Hmm.
So, like, if you like that kind of style of lyrics, then you'll love what Van Dyke Parks did. That's not for everybody, though. I know some people can't stand cut
Right.
up. They think it's just like pretentious. For me, it depends on the song, but everybody's different.
Right.
Yeah, I really think that some of like you said some of the best in the catalog, and I would say some of the best songs truly ever written came from Mike's pen and Brian's composing. And specifically, I love that you mentioned When I Grow Up. I know I've said this when we talked about MIU and Winds of Change, but the Beach Boys, that's become a concert staple for them. And every time I hear them sing that, more and more each year, I'm really emotional and choked up to see Mike in his 80s singing that because it kind of answers the questions of the lyrics, like
Mhm.
the embodiment of the answer to those questions is standing on stage singing you the song. So it's really moving. And yeah, I guess, slightly moving along to obviously, I think there's even forgive me if I'm butchering the pronunciation, maturation,
Yeah,
Yeah.
maturing, maturation of Mike's writing as you go into summer days. I think a lot of Mike's earliest lyrics were very niche to what was happening in California, but the Beach Boys had been doing so much national touring that on summer days, the lyrics start to, expand a little bit. And so obviously, California Girls is such a grand slam out of the park, and it's just such an evocative lyric that creates these beautiful images in your mind. And the story with that song goes that Brian had been spending hours on the track, and as he was just putting the final touches on, he sent Mike into the hallway with a legal pad and a pen and told Mike to write the lyrics. And in, probably 5, 10 minutes, Mike came up with those iconic lyrics, and it's just such a cool story about, you know.
Mhm.
Right. It's a good set of lyrics when like you can memorize the whole thing and just sing along with it at every show. And like, yeah, it's just such memorable lyrics. You can see why it's one of the band's most iconic songs. Like, obviously, musically, it's a fantastic song, one of Brian's very best. But really, I think it's the lyrics that really stick with people just as much because of really what it represents in terms of the band's image and basically representing like the sound of summer, and yeah, like the California imagery and all the creative ways that Mike describes the different girls around the world. And yeah, it's
A
just a
French bikini on Hawaiian Island dolls by a palm
exactly.
tree in the sand. That's just like so pleasing to the ear.
and it flows so well, you know, like it really is like a, even though like the lyrics you could say are a little bit cheesy, like it really is like almost like it's summer poetry, you know, like it flows really well.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Another song I wanted to highlight from Summer Days and Summer Nights, Let 'Em Run Wild. This is one of my favorite songs in the whole Beach Boys catalog, probably my favorite on the album. And literally like one of my favorite parts of the song, besides like the amazing production from Brian and the songwriting and the really moving lyrics, but the guess you know I've waited for you girl line that Mike sings there. I always like that's like the highlight of that song for me. I absolutely love that little transition there. I think Mike sings that so well. And yeah, it's just like, yeah, really moving song lyrically, one that I feel like people can really connect with, and one of the most moving songs in the band's catalog. I think it's a really moving track. So just wanted to highlight that one because I think Mike's contribution to that one is really great.
There's also Help Me Rhonda on there, which I think Mike did a pretty good job of lyrics on that one too, where it's like it's a very upbeat sounding song, but it's kind of a depressing song because it's basically
Right.
like, hey, this girl
Yeah.
with me, I'm depressed. I don't even want to get out of bed, but
Yeah.
let's hook up so I can get over her.
Yeah. Help her get her out of my mind pretty much. Right. It's kind of trying to get over somebody. Right. Right.
It's one of those
And
songs
you,
that has the upbeat sounding melody with like the kind of depressing lyrics. You know what I mean? Like the dichotomy.
and
Yeah.
something about today is that it was written as one of Mike's marriages was ending in 64 and another one was beginning in 65. So I think a lot of side B, as much as you'd imagine it being about Brian, I think a lot of the relationship sort of turmoil songs were literally Mike writing about, his then recent divorce on Today, and, even some of the slower songs on Summer Days too.
Yeah. Real quick, I just wanted to go back real quick to Today, to mention one other track I wanted to just shout out. I know you guys talked about it briefly, but I just wanted to highlight one of Mike's parts in the song, "Kiss Me, Baby." I love Mike's vocals on that one, especially on the "Late, late last night we said it was over." I've always loved the way that he sings that. And yeah, just like you guys said about that song, really moving lyrics from all the ballads on Today, that Mike helped contribute. So really deep and moving lyrics on both that album and on Summer Days and Summer Nights with tracks like Let 'Em Run Wild. So definitely a clear evolution there in the band's songwriting style and the themes that they were dealing with. Moving on from Summer Days and Summer Nights, so then obviously in between Summer Days and Summer Nights and Pet Sounds, the band put out Party. And I just wanted to highlight the track Devoted to You, which I think is a beautiful cover because of like the amazing vocal blend between Brian and Mike. Their voices harmonize
Yeah.
well, and I feel like this track is a textbook example of how well their voices work together. Really beautiful cover of the Everly Brothers song, and just absolutely love it.
I also wanted to highlight Mike's cover of Mountain of Love. I actually
Yeah,
think that's a very well done cover. I'm actually a pretty big fan of Party. I think this is an album that gets a bit too much hate, or it's just,
I love Party too.
but I really enjoy it just because it's basically just like them in the studio with some acoustic guitars and some bongo drums and like just goofing off, and yet it's good because like it's just like this shows the raw talent on display. Some of it's a little corny, like some of the and some of the I'm not a huge fan of some of the more novelty songs they cover, but I really do think Mike did a great job of Mountain of Love. I think he really sells the lyrics with his vocal performance, like like you should be ashamed. You used to be a
yeah.
mountain of love. I just think like I can feel the pain in the vocal, so I really really do love that cover. I thought he did an amazing job on that cover, so I wanted to highlight that one as well.
Yeah. So obviously, I guess I would throw into the mix the intro, hook of Barbara Ann. You hear Mike's ba ba ba, and that's an instant earworm, and Mike's voice is perfect for that. But as we're rolling from 65 to 66, I feel like there's something we should mention before we get too far away from the early 60s and mid 60s, is that Mike was really one of the, founding members of the frontman Mount Rushmore. I'd put it, like the Beach Boys were one of the earliest rock and roll bands. There
Mhm.
were a lot of rock and roll stars like Elvis and Chuck Berry, but as far as rock bands went, the Beach Boys were very early in that race, so to speak. And so Mike was sort of the guinea pig for what like a frontman should be. And of course, Mike experimented with doing a little bit of the saxophone and maybe dialing up the goofy stuff or being really flamboyant later on in the 70s. But Mike was really on the cutting edge of what it meant to be a frontman of a rock band. And he, got his shtick together pretty quick. And, by the time the band was touring, he was able to sort of carry the show as MC and create the set lists every night.
All right, so now moving on to the band's often most acclaimed, most beloved album, Pet Sounds. I think something notable with this album in terms of Mike is that I know there's a stereotype that exists that like Mike was anti-Pet Sounds. Mike was against this idea of Brian making this more complex, non-commercial pop music. But really, if you read a lot of the quotes from him, both like from the time and like in retrospect, like really honestly, most of the quotes I've seen, it's been nothing but praise for the album. He's listed it as his favorite Beach Boys album before. There's a quote that he wrote where he said it's his favorite album is Pet Sounds because the orchestrations and arrangements, because it's not just about cars or girls or school, but it's about feelings, which I think was a good way to put it. And yeah, I think it's one of those things where like people just like to villainize Mike and say like Mike was just against Brian's development as a songwriter and producer. But really, it kind of goes back to what you said at the beginning, Nate. Like, I can understand the band being a little bit apprehensive or a little bit nervous about Brian going in a different direction, especially Mike, because really, like you said, Nate, for Mike, music was everything. Was selling records and touring, and that was basically his way to make a living. So if I put myself in his shoes, I would probably be a little bit nervous too. To have my cousin or a family member in a band take the band in a different direction that may not be as successful. But still, like as I said though, Mike really, if you read the quotes, he seems to have been very complimentary of the album over the years. He made some really great contributions to the album vocally. And yeah, I mean, we can get into the contributions in a bit, but do you guys kind of want to talk a little bit about Mike and Pet Sounds and kind of the whole stereotype that exists about him with the album?
Well, I think a lot of it is probably misquoted if I had to imagine, where like, who's going to listen to this shit, the ears of a dog. There's like a lot of these narratives that have been spun over the years and various things. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's people just making stuff up because they had a vendetta against somebody. I wouldn't be surprised. It happens all the time. But I also think maybe part of it too, and I know we're going to touch on this, is maybe the lawsuit for the songwriting credits. I think maybe like things like, I think some people were really incensed that he got a credit on Wouldn't It Be Nice, to be frank. I think people just thought that was ridiculous and it should have never happened. Some people think that the lawsuit should never happen, period. I wouldn't go that far, but I do think getting a songwriting credit for 2 lines at the end of a song was a little bit much. And I think Tony Asher himself even said like he was kind of surprised that Mike ever got the credit for that because Mike didn't really add much. Maybe that's part of it, honestly.
Yeah, songwriting credits are interesting because like in the legal perspective of it, it doesn't so much matter like how much one contributed. It's, like a matter of making sure that everyone that did contribute is accounted for. But that's a whole bag of worms as far as the lawsuit. But in Pet Sound specifically, I think Jake, you expressed that just like very beautifully and very succinctly, like better than I could have ever, about how on one hand he's been nothing but positive about the album, but that clearly he did express some concern. I think you described that perfectly. Yeah, and I also think with some of those quotes like who's gonna hear this shit, the ears of a dog, or the formula, or this or that, like Mike and Brian were clearly like very close in their childhood and in the early 60s, and I'm sure like most cousins and most close friends, they ribbed each other a lot and made fun of each other and weren't afraid to dish it out a little bit. And that was even made fun of with the whole track on Shutdown Volume 2, the so
Love it.
I believe that Mike could have said something that maybe to some assistant or some intern in the studio that heard the conversation would maybe sound insensitive, but really that maybe was just the way that he and Brian talk to each other, like the way that most guys talk to their friends. But yeah, with Pet Sounds, I think you could make the argument that it's some of Mike's greatest, both lyrical and vocal contributions of his career. Like 2 that instantly spring to mind are, or 3 maybe. Obviously, I think his vocals in Wouldn't It Be Nice are super iconic and super beautiful. I think you can debate the whole credits with the good night baby, sleep tight baby part, but it's very moving and it's like the perfect cherry on top with that song. And his vocals in the bridge are really nice. And I think his lyrics on I'm Waiting for the Day are perfect and they fit really well with Tony Asher's lyrics. And as with other vocals with his leads, I think Here Today and That's Not Me are some of, hands down, some of the greatest Beach Boy vocals, some of the greatest Mike Love vocals. Really emotive. They still have that Beach Boy sound, but it's like a more mature version of like the fun voice, you know,
Right.
a more adult version. So yeah, Mike's vocals on Pet Sounds are, one of the greatest key ingredients, I'd say.
Yeah, I do love I would say probably the Here Today vocal is arguably my favorite Mike vocal. I thought he just sang the hell out of that song. I know he wrote what was it originally called? Hang On to Your Ego, as I know there's an answer as well.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Not the biggest fan of that song, but it has nothing to do with Mike. I just don't really, it's just all right for me. One of my least favorites on Pet Sounds. But yeah, I do agree with everything you said though. I think the vocal work on Wouldn't It Be Nice is wonderful. That's Not Me. He does a great job on that one. But for me, I would say Here Today is probably his best vocal on Pet Sounds. I absolutely love that vocal.
I
Yeah.
do think I know there's an answer. It was a positive change because I do think with Hang On to Your Ego, maybe not in 66, but in hindsight, it's like, okay, this is an LSD song. But with I Know There's an Answer, it makes it very kind of mystical and sort of makes you wonder what the answer is. And it sort of gives it a more, the listener can interpret whatever they think it means, versus Hang On to Your Ego is like a very direct
Right.
aspect of acid culture. So I think that was like a positive change and made it more of like a universal kind of searching lyric.
Yeah, I mean, my like kind of what is the word I'm looking for? Ambivalence to that song has nothing to do with the lyrics.
Yeah.
Nah. I think also sandwiched in between God Only Knows and Here Today kind of makes it suffer a little bit by comparison.
Yeah. Yeah, to talk about some of the songs you guys mentioned, yeah, Mike's part on Wouldn't It Be Nice is amazing. The maybe if we think and wish and hope and pray it might come true. That's a really great vocal from him. That's Not Me. Yeah, that's one of my favorite Mike vocals. I think it's such an emotive delivery from him. I especially love the way he sings the line, what matters to me is what I could be to just one girl. I've always really loved that line, and I think a lot of it is like the way he sings it. Like it really sounds genuine coming from his voice. And like Nate said, it's kind of like an evolution of like, okay, this is still the Beach Boys. That's clearly Mike Love's voice, but just the themes and the lyrics and the subject matter has just really matured, where it's now a more grown up sound. Also, yeah, like Matt mentioned, Here Today is a great vocal from Mike. Honestly, it's probably like the highlight of that song for me is Mike's vocal. Like, that's never been one of my absolute favorites on Pet Sounds, but it's one of those songs where like I can't imagine anyone but Mike singing it. I think Mike just absolutely sings the hell out of it, like Matt said, and I think his vocal really elevates the song for me. Where it's a song that I do come back to more than I would otherwise if someone else had sung it. So. Great song there, and obviously also Mike's parts on Sloop John B are nice as well during the verses. Very recognizable vocals there as well. So,
Yeah, totally.
all right, so now moving on to the Smile album or the canceled Smile album. Similar to Pet Sounds, it's another one where a lot of people kind of say that like Mike was completely against the project, and while there definitely are like some quotes you can read where like Mike was definitely a bit skeptical. I know specifically with Van Dyke Parks with like questioning what the lyrics mean. Like I know there's the infamous over and over the crow cries, uncover the cornfield, where Mike's like, what does it mean? But honestly, again, kind of like to echo what I said with Pet Sounds, I can understand the concern, like obviously Pet Sounds it was still a successful album, especially in like the UK, but in the US, it wasn't their most successful. It was definitely a little bit of a disappointment for Capitol. So I can kind of see the concern where like, now Brian's going to release an album that's even more out there in terms of the lyrical themes and the music, and just the uncommercial aspects of the album. So I can understand his concern about it, but again, people can say what they want, but Mike still contributed all of his parts that he was told to contribute, whether he understood what he was singing or not. And if you read some quotes from Mike, there's a quote I wrote down from 1970 where Mike said that he thought that Smile was good stuff and a fantastically produced album. And also, Brian has said before that the collapse of Smile was not due to Love's opposition to the lyrics. So, and of course, there's also the infamous "Don't fuck with the formula" expression, which, from what I've heard, was never actually directly said. Like, maybe I know Mike has said something like, "It sounds like something I would have said."
Yes.
But from what I've read, it really was just something that I believe it was David Anderley, one of Brian's friends, who first coined the quote, and then people really just kind of ran with it. But yeah, that's pretty much my thoughts on Smile and Mike's connection with it. I really, again, I can understand Mike being a little bit hesitant with it, but in the end, he still recorded his parts. He sang what Brian wanted him to sing, and he still said complimentary things about the album over the years. So, another one I think people really misinterpret Mike's reaction to it.
Yeah, I think that was a great way to put it. Like, people can write about it and argue about how Mike felt about the album, but the proof is in the pudding that he delivered some great vocals on the album, and he has less leads on some of the Smile and Smiley Smile stuff, but his backing vocals were extremely crucial. You think
Yeah.
about things like Our Prayer or Surf's Up or these songs with these very dense harmonies. Mike's vocals are so crucial to that blend. And of course, you can't talk about this era without mentioning what is probably the peak of Brian and Mike's collaborative journey, which was Good Vibrations.
Mhm.
And I think it's just such the epitome of what made their partnership so amazing. And that Brian had this music that literally sounds like it came from Mars and is the most far out backing track you've ever heard, with all the tempo changes and key changes. And, who in the world could have made that a relatable pop song? But Mike Love, rose to the task and created the words and the hooks to Brian's amazing track that just made the song so timeless. And of course, there's that classic story that they had come up with the hook together, of course, but the verses were still spotty. And, Tony Asher took a swing at the verses, but the band didn't really like his lyrics. And so Mike had known for a while that he had to write new lyrics for the verses, but had been procrastinating until the night that the band were set to record the vocals. So Mike is literally driving to the studio with his wife, Suzanne, and he's driving and he's dictating her the words for the verses of Good Vibrations as they drive to the studio. And Mike walks in, with the lyrics that are, possibly the most iconic lyrics of the psychedelic 60s counterculture. The lyrics so perfectly encapsulate the whole flower power hippie kind of feeling of the mid 60s. And it's just a perfect collaboration.
Iconic lyrics there, like you said, Nate. Yeah, just the opening line. I love the colorful clothes she wears and the way the sunlight plays upon her hair. It's like such a great poetic lyric, and I've always loved the line "I don't know where, but she sends me there."
I was gonna say that too.
Like Mike both like lyric contributions ever. Like that's such like a badass lyric. And yeah, it's just a great song, like you said, a great hook from Mike, and he took a song that, like you said, sounded otherworldly, and made it commercial, and a song that would end up becoming a number 1 hit for the band. So no doubt Mike played a big role in that song's success.
And I think he contributed a word to the English language with Excitations.
Excitations, that's true. True.
It's such like a Beach Boys kind of word, like it's
right.
So cool.
One other track I wanted to shout out from the Smile sessions, Cabin Essence. I love Mike's backing vocals during the "Who Ran the Iron Horse." Like that's very like distinctive. And yeah, just a great vocal from him on that. Really like gives it that like really driving power of like a train going down the tracks,
And his lead on the coda,
what?
his lead on the coda of that song.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about
the
that.
over and over part that he,
Yeah.
got into a hissy fit about apparently. But the way he sung those vocals is, to me, one of the best moments on Smile. Like such a haunting vocal delivery with the almost kind of stagnant melody. Da, 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 da. Like it's very static melodically, right, but the way he delivers it with the echo and everything is just so haunting.
Mm-hmm. Matt, any thoughts?
Good Vibrations is great. One of the greatest pop songs ever written. No, it really is though. And I think that he really did capture that, like flower power hippie vibe well, because I know that this band, and especially him, had a reputation of being very, very square.
Right.
I do think that he did capture that whole thing very, very well in that song. As far as the Smile stuff goes, he's just not really as prominent, I know, on a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, and I know he didn't like really write any of it, so I don't really have much to add to what you guys already said about the Smile stuff too much.
I'd
Yeah.
also add that my favorite version of Heroes and Villains is the one that alternates with Mike and Brian switching off like every line of the verses. I think that edit sounds really cool.
Which
Mhm.
version is that? There's like 75 versions of it.
Yeah, I believe if I recall correctly, it's on the Made in California box set.
Oh, okay. I have that box set, but it's been a while since I've listened to it.
And I guess one more with the whole smile, smiley smile is sort of earlier how you mentioned sort of like the real far out lyrics. What was you said cut up lyrics was
Cut up
your
lyrics. 'Cause it's
expression?
you kind of like write stuff and then you kind of like almost like mix it up and rearrange.
Yeah, like a Dylan, John Lennon kind of thing. I
Bowie
think
did a lot.
the closest Mike got was with that kind of lyric was probably She's Going Bald.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that one already started as a bit of a park because that was originally he gives speeches. Yeah, yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. Lennon, Dylan, Bowie, Cobain, Radiohead, like they all love to do that kind of stuff.
And then I think yeah, She's Going Bald was one that he contributed. Oh, and Getting Hungry. Getting Hungry is so out there too.
Yeah, released as a single too, right? At the
Yeah,
time.
It says
Brian.
Brian and Mike, yeah.
Yeah.
Mike's
Yeah.
vocal on that song it's super different and kind of weird, but it does give the song like that whole song, the verses give you that kind of smoky bar, like a guy singing in like a dark bar with shades on or something, and that song sort of, his vocal on that is cool.
I wake up in the morning. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. My issue I've
like
always had with that song is just I don't like how it's mixed, but it has nothing to do with anything they did.
Yeah.
It's so quiet and it gets like super loud all of a sudden.
totally. And then, you know, Wild Honey is a super Mike heavy album.
Yep.
Yep.
I think Mike wrote or co-wrote every song on Wild Honey, with the only exception being the Stevie Wonder cover.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, and it makes sense, with Mike having such an R&B influence growing up. It makes sense like that him and Brian would get back together again to do like an R&B kind of soulful style record. And yeah, there's a lot of great contributions on here from him, specifically his vocal on "Aren't You Glad." I think is really great. One of my favorite Mike leads on like a deeper cut. Really great vocal there. And also his vocals on the verses of "Let the Wind Blow." I also really love a lot as well. I think he sings that really well too. So some great contributions from Mike on "Wild Honey," and again some cool lyrics as well on songs like "Here Comes the Night" and "Wild Honey," the title track, and quite a few others. So definitely some strong contributions there.
Let the Wind Blow has some of my favorite Mike Love lyrics ever. Let the bees make honey, let the poor find money, take away their sorrows, give them sunshine tomorrow.
That is a killer line. Yeah, I love that line.
Yeah,
Nope.
Sunshine Tomorrow is they're like, okay, we got to save this for a box set name someday.
Right. Yeah, couldn't have picked a better name for that box set, right? Yeah.
We couldn't have.
Yeah, I think sort of if you are to talk about Mike Love's like artistic growth and his development as an artist, I would say like sort of how we mentioned Today and Summer Days is like a point where you see the growth. I'd say you definitely see the growth on Wild Honey. Um, you guys mentioned some really great lyrics, and I think this is the album where he discovers his kind of like soft Mike Love voice that you hear again on like Big Sur and All I Want to Do.
Yeah.
Sort of that really gentle, mellow voice, which worked really well for some of the more sunshine pop, sort of bedroom lo-fi stuff that they were doing as the 60s came to a close. And I guess this is probably an odd comparison, but I've always loved A Hard Day's Night album by the Beatles because it's the first and only Beatles album that are completely Lennon-McCartney songs.
Mhm.
And there was never a Beach Boys album that were only Brian and Mike songs, but this is obviously the closest. With the exception of the Stevie Wonder, it's all Brian and Mike's collaboration.
Well, and
So
It is no Brian on that song.
Oh, right. Mike and Bruce and Carl and Al, right? Yeah. Um, so yeah, it's definitely, you know, we all know the story of when Brian took a step back with the leadership. You had Carl, taking the reins a lot, but also Mike, and you see those kind of wheels spinning as far as the Wild Honey album goes.
So then moving on to the band's next album, Friends from 1968. On this album, it opens up with another song where Mike's doing that really smooth vocal delivery with Meant for You, which is a really, again, only like a 20-second, 25-second track, but such a beautiful vocal from Mike on that. And again, this is another album where Brian and Mike are really writing together again throughout the album. Another highlight for Mike on this album is Annalie the Healer. I've always loved Mike's vocal on that track. I think it's a really catchy little song. One of my favorite Beach Boys deep cuts from this era. And yeah, it's just a really smooth vocal delivery. And yeah, I really love Mike's vocals from this era in general. I think that he really had found a voice that really worked well for him with the band's new styles that they were experimenting with at the time, with kind of this lo-fi, kind of chill, laid-back sound. And yeah, I love Mike's vocal delivery on a lot of these tracks. So what are your guys' thoughts on some of the Friends material and some of Mike's contributions?
Well, what's interesting about the Friends stuff is that some of the bass vocals aren't even Mike, they're Murray because he was in India at the time. But yeah, I would say for me, the highlight from Mike on here is definitely for me, Annalie the Healer. I really love that song. I know that that song was written based off of some of his experiences in India. So that's a really fun one. He also wrote Transcendental Meditation. He helped with that song. Not that one, so the less. And I do like Meant for You as well, but I just wish it was a little bit longer. It's just a little short, but it works well where it is.
Yeah, so like has been mentioned, Mike was gone for like a lot of the production of Friends.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd say the fact that he was in India and he was calling the guys, particularly Dennis, who at this time was like pretty interested in meditation too, and telling them the stories of what the Maharishi had been saying and, with the Beatles, hanging out with the Beatles. And, I think Mike, the phone calls were also few and far between. So sending letters to the guys. And I think that whole Mike doing that while he was away, it still had a big influence on the whole vibe of the Friends album. I think, it inspired Brian to write a lot of music that fit that whole journey Mike was going through. So a lot of the album still reflects that sort of Indian, for lack of a better term, influence or Eastern philosophy that Mike was bringing to the band. It's kind of interesting. In the late 60s and 70s, Mike sort of became what George was to the Beatles at the end of their career, with bringing in that whole TM and Eastern vibe to the group. So I think you can definitely draw a parallel there with what Mike would contribute on this album and over the next few years for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were Pisces brothers. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, but yeah,
Yep.
there you go. Oh, he's got it ready to go. I love that. Yeah, so yeah, it's important to mention though, yeah, like we've talked about, that this was the period when Mike really first started getting really into transcendental meditation, with seeing the Beatles going over there and then him going over to meet the Maharishi, and something that's
And going with the Beatles, yeah.
right, and hanging out with the Beatles, right. And something that's important to remember, I know that most of our Beach Boys listeners know this already, but like, like this wasn't something where like Mike was just doing it just to like, oh, it's the cool thing to do at the time. Like, let's check out this, transcendental meditation thing and like, talk to the Maharishi just because, it's the cool thing to do. He really, really got into this, and it's something that, he's continued to this day. I know he's kind of advanced through, I don't know if the word is like the rankings or the levels of like TM, but I just know that
he became like a like someone who has the proper channels to be able to teach it to other people. You have to be like certified to do that. That's the word I was looking for, certification. He's like a certified teacher.
Also, I think like if I imagine that finding a transcendental meditation was something that probably was good for Mike's state of mind as well, like in terms of like his like finding his inner self. And I think again you can kind of like hear that with like the vocals on a lot of his performances from around this time. Like they're very peaceful sounding, and really a lot of the band's music from around this time had a very peaceful sound as well, specifically on Friends. So I feel like that's definitely Mike's involvement with transcendental meditation. I feel is definitely reflected in the music as well. So
Yeah, I
Um,
think you can say what you will about TM and Maharishi as a pseudo-religious and pseudo-political movement. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion there.
yeah.
But I think without a doubt, TM more or less saved the lives of the members of the Beatles and the Beach Boys that we still have with us. I think they would
Mhm.
all credit meditation with helping them, you know, have clarity in their health.
Um,
Particularly Mike, who did actually have a little bit of struggles with alcohol, emphasis on a little bit, but nonetheless, it's a very serious topic,
right,
especially with the Wilson genes. But, when Mike started meditating is when he stopped drinking. And,
right.
huge reason why we still have him performing.
Hmm. So then in 1969, the band releases 2020, which is the band's last like studio album for Capitol. I know they also had that live in London album, but really it was kind of their last album for Capitol at the time. I know that they weren't in a great place at that time in terms of like their sales were down. But they did have a hit song with Do It Again in 1968, which was a Mike and Brian co-write. Kind of like the first example of the band kind of doing like a throwback style sound to their early sound and kind of recapturing those early themes, but kind of presenting it with a more modern sound, like with that cool drum effect on the track. I like Mike's vocals on this song. Love that beautiful bridge section that Brian sings. I believe it is Brian, or is it Brian or Carl that sings the
I think
bridge?
it's Brian and Carl together.
Gotcha. But yeah, I always really like that song. I know it's not Matt's favorite track, but definitely a solid track and one that kind of got the band back in the charts for a bit. So definitely worth mentioning.
Yeah, that's Do It Again is probably like tied for my number one. I just love that song, and I have such great memories of the Beach Boys starting their concerts with it, and just like all the excitement you feel when they finally come on stage and go into that number. It's like
Yeah.
a high.
So then after that, 1970 is kind of a changing year for the band. They switch labels. They go to Warner Reprise, and they release their first album on that label, Sunflower. In terms of Mike's contributions, some of my favorites on Sunflower. Add Some Music to Your Day. I love his vocals on that track. I know that a lot of the guys kind of share a lead on that song, but I really love Mike's part with like the opening, the Sunday morning gospel goes good with the soul. The track "It's About Time." I've always really loved Mike's backing vocals on that track, like the "It's About Time, It's About Time." Now I've always really liked that. I know there's that performance of them doing this song in Central Park in 1971, where Mike's got like the tambourine and he's kind of dressed like a farmer, and he's rocking out to that song. So always like that as well. Of course, the big highlight for Mike on Sunflower, "All I Want to Do," which in my opinion is one of Mike's greatest lead vocals ever. Just an absolutely amazing vocal. Like Nate said earlier, he's kind of singing in this really smooth style that he kind of developed in the late 60s. And it really fits this song well, kind of like an early example of like dream pop, and just a really, really cool track. And Mike's vocal definitely elevates it to another level. And then the track "Cool Cool Water," the closer. Love Mike's backing vocals on this track, especially of course, the "In an Ocean or in a Glass," "Cool Water." Definitely a fun line there from Mike. So, yeah, a lot of great contributions from Mike on Sunflower and really from the whole band. The band was really working well as a whole unit at this time and contributing some of the best material that they put out in years. So, any thoughts on Mike's contributions to Sunflower?
Basically, just what you said. It's a great album, and all I want to do is probably the highlight. And not only the vocal that he sings it, but I think also the all the reverb that Carl threw on it too is like
Yeah.
that song's so magical.
Yeah, I think the cool thing about this era is that Mike actually wrote songs with basically every member of the band. He had on, Wild Honey, he had written How She Boogalooed It with Carl and all those guys and Bruce, and he would go on, he wrote with Bruce actually in the late 60s on Don't Run Away, and in the 70s he would write songs with Dennis, Only with You and Pacific Ocean Blues, and he would write obviously with Brian, and he would write with Al.
Hmm.
So, it was cool to see Mike's pen on music by all the different guys. But yeah, with Sunflower, I'm so glad you mentioned that line on Cool Cool Water. I think his lyrics are really fun. I think his almost like the sort of Papa Uma Mao-esque vocals he does on Got to Know the Woman are cool too. And I think he also has some really great like bass vocals on This Whole World. Like some of the his parts in the harmony stack sound
Hmm.
really great on that song.
Hmm. One other thing I wanted to mention too, I believe All I Want to Do, I want to say Mike probably wrote the words to that as well, right? Was it
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Brian Mike co-write? Yeah, I mean, I love those lyrics. I think those lyrics are they're very simple, but they're very moving and just like a beautiful love song. So yeah, I
Yeah,
love his,
my love is burning brightly like moon and stars shine nightly is
and
really a gorgeous line.
I definitely. And then also, let these little words of love become the lamps that light your way. Very poetic line too. So a lot of great lyrics in that song for sure. So then, 1971, we get the second Warner Reprise album from the Beach Boys, Surfs Up. Obviously, as Beach Boys fans know, this is kind of the band. This is kind of where they started exploring more political themes, more social themes to kind of be more relevant with the times, with like the counterculture movement. And we see Mike doing this on several examples on this album, like "Don't Go Near the Water," which was an Alan Mike co-write that kind of deals with like lyrical themes about the environment and pollution. Really like Mike's vocals on the verses of this song. I think they're very like almost like haunting in a way. I really like his vocal delivery. And it's very clear from the start of the album that like this is not the Beach Boys that people knew from years prior. Like this is a whole new band pretty much in terms of their sound that they're going for.
Yeah, it's so interesting to note that when you hear "Don't Go Near the Water" come on, that this is the same guy that 10 years prior wrote "Surfing," and it's basically the complete opposite message. And this is the guy who wrote "Fun, Fun, Fun" and "Driving" is now singing about war protests and student demonstrations. So, yeah, a really interesting evolution for sure.
And then, yeah, of course, student demonstration time, kind of dealing with like student police violence and riots. Definitely not my favorite song, not my favorite vocal from Mike either. But I can appreciate what they were going for. I just think that the lyrics are not the strongest and kind of make the message very unclear for what they're trying to say.
I
But
do
yeah,
think pen is mightier than the sword, but no match for a gun is a really cool line.
it is. It is an amazing lyric. I know Riley loves that one. Riley's mentioned that one before. So yeah, great lyric there. One thing I wanted to clarify with you, Nate, on the song "Till I Die," at the end, "These things I'll be until I die," is that Mike?
Yeah,
I,
such a cool
I
vocal.
love his vocal on that. That is so cool. It's like it's a great way to end the album as it or end the song as it fades out. Yeah, with yeah, "These things I'll be until I die." Well, you've got Brian and Carl, I think, like harmonizing so hauntingly at the same time. So really, really great way to close that song.
And his great child, child, child on the closing of Surf's Up is really
Right.
beautiful too.
Matt, any thoughts on some of the Surf's Up material?
Basically what you said. Don't really have anything to add to that, but I did want to discuss briefly "Sound of Free," that Dennis Rumbo
Mhm.
song that was around this time that Mike wrote the lyrics for. I really love that song. I think it's a great song.
Yeah.
Kind of cool to see Dennis expand his wings a little bit outside of the group, because I know that that was originally supposed to be like kind of the lead single for a solo album around this time that never came around. But yeah, no, I really like that song as well. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that one.
Yeah, I had that one
Yeah,
written.
the songs that Dennis and Mike wrote together had like a really modern or like contemporary would probably be a better word, contemporary feel that was absent on some of the other Beach Boys songs at this time.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so now moving on to 1972, we get Carl and the Passions, So Tough, where really this is kind of a unique album for the band because you have Ricky and Blondie join the band, and they really kind of bring in a whole new sound and style to the group. In terms of Mike's contributions on this album, the two that I wanted to mention were Marcella, where I really love his vocals at the end.
One arm over.
At that, sandals dance at my feet. Yeah, ooh, Marcella, so sweet. Always really love that a lot. And then on the song "All This Is That," which is one of my all-time favorite Beach Boys songs. It's an Alan Mike co-write, and I absolutely love this song. I love the lyrics. Very kind of like again, they're kind of leaning into like the TM themes with the lyrics. I know it's also based on the Robert Frost poem, "The Road Not Taken," but very, very nice poetic lyrics. Really dreamy production, and I love the vocals from both Mike and Al throughout this track, and of course Carl as well, with that haunting fade out at the end with the J Guru Dev. But really love Mike's vocals on this. I texted you before we started recording, Nate, about this song. So I've heard multiple people say that Al sings part of the lead and Mike sings part of the lead, but I've also heard some people say that it's both of them. So do you kind of want to clarify to any of our listeners that weren't sure about this song and who actually sings the different lead parts on it?
Well, yeah, to the best of my knowledge, it's Al and Mike each have their own sort of respective lines that they take, but I'd say like the bulk of the song where it's not Carl is Mike and Al singing in unison, is what it sounds like to me. I think most of it is them just singing the same part, and obviously they had a really good vocal blend, so it is sort of hard to tell. But yeah, a lot of their songs about TM or that have that Eastern influence sound like they're trying to sell you on it. But this one is just so mystical and so genuine and really just sounds like otherworldly.
Yeah.
Frankly, like I meditate, and this song was the thing that sold me on having an interest in meditation because I was like, okay, if they can write a song like this with these words and these harmonies about TM, like I got to see what this shit's all about.
Yeah, yeah. No, one of my to highlight a lyric from this song that I really love, just because it's a Mike and Al co-write, so Mike contributed a lot to the lyrics. I love the line, life supporting waves of bliss, Mother Divine's precious kiss brings with love the light of wisdom and the gift of eternal freedom. Really love that lyric. It like flows so smoothly. And yeah, it's
And
just
golden auras glow around you is nice
I love
too.
that one too, where it sounds like I believe it's it sounds like Mike or Al is like right in your ear on that one. That's
Yeah,
all.
that's Mike on that part.
Yeah,
Let's
that's
see,
a very
golden auras glow around you, omnipresent love surrounds you. Yeah.
yeah. Wisdom warming as the sun, you and I are truly one. Yeah, it's a great line.
So good. So beautiful.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like genuine religious
Right. I guess
scripture almost.
right. Yeah. Uh Matt, any thoughts on the songs we've discussed or any other additional tracks from Carl and the Passions?
Marcella's great, and you're right. Mike is. I like how it's like in that section of the song, it's like Mike and then followed by Dennis. I think that really works well.
Yeah.
All This Is That's a beautiful song. Probably my second favorite on Carl and the Passions, behind Here She Comes. But I love that song. It's very beautiful and it's a very vibey song, like a very chill song. And what I like about it too is like it conveys like the benefits of TM without sounding too much like a commercial. The biggest issue I've had with Transcendental Meditation on Friends, it sounds like a freaking commercial. Like it sounds too like on the nose. This I think does a better job of portraying what it's like to go through that whole experience. The other song you didn't mention is He Come Down.
Yes,
I'm not the biggest fan of that song, but I do think Mike sings it well. I think the issue I've always had with that song is a little too on the gospel-y side for me. Like, yes, I believe. It's just a little too much for me. Like, it's very. But I do think Mike does sing it well, and I do like some of the lyrics in that song. But again, it's also a little bit more on like the kind of like shove it down your throat side for me too.
Yeah, that one's kind of like the opposite of All This Is That, where like I can see what they were going for, but like it's very like on the nose, like with the Maharishi teaches us to meditate. Like, all right, Mike, like thank you for that.
One thing I'd say about that song that I think is kind of cool is, so the Beach Boys, everyone calls them America's band, and I think at this point in time they were kind of going for being like a different type of America's band, and I think both with their lineup and even this song, it definitely has like a very, I'd almost put it as like an American melting pot kind of vibe, given that they now were like an integrated group. And I think He Come Down is almost kind of quintessentially American because it's so out there to have a song that speaks about like Christianity and Eastern philosophy in the same breath, in the same like sentence, and I think that is like kind of neat and kind of cool. Like, a lot of people would feel like you couldn't like have a song with both of those topics in there, and people would maybe think it was sacrilegious or whatever, but I think it's kind of cool in a way of like uniting people and sort of being a bit of like a melting pot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, actually. Yeah. All right, so then in 1973, the band puts out the Holland album. Obviously, they flew to Holland in the Netherlands to record this album in 1972. I know they obviously had a lot of difficulties there with setting up like the mixing desk and everything. So it sounds like it was a really expensive kind of venture there. But they did get it done. And they ended up putting out what I think is one of their strongest later period albums in terms of like their post hits catalog. I think this is one of their very best from their early 70s period. And Mike contributes some really great moments on here as well. Obviously, we have to mention California Saga, Big Sur, which is a song that Mike actually wrote and performed. And I think he did an incredible job with it. I think the lyrics on this song are great. Again, they are very descriptive. They kind of paint a picture. And yeah, I just think it's a really beautiful song in both versions, both the Holland version that's kind of like the more like country kind of folk style, as well as the version that you can listen to on Theo Flows from like 1970. So really beautiful song and really shows Mike's capabilities as a songwriter for sure. Knowing that he wrote this song by himself. So really cool track there. Leaving this town, I've always really liked Mike's backing vocals at the end, the leaving this town, this town. I've always really liked that a lot. Only with You, I think, which maybe you mentioned, Nate, already, is a Dennis and Mike co-write, which is a really beautiful song. I know it's not everybody's favorite from what I've seen, but I do really like it a lot. And I think the lyrics are very moving as well, kind of a pretty love ballad. So I really like that one. And then lastly, Funky Pretty. I love Mike's contributions on this song, some of his vocal contributions, like Me and My Pisces Lady Are Apart. I've always really liked that. Just a lot of fun lyrics on that song about like astrology and just a cool track. So what are your guys' thoughts on Holland and some of Mike's contributions there?
Well, Holland is my favorite Beach Boys album. I have now decided that. And Big Star, I wanted to give a shout out to the 71. I think it's from 71, the 70s, the earlier in the decade version.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's that box set called? Theo Flows. That's a really good version too. That's a very dream poppy version. But I also love this version too. It's just a very well written song, and it shows that Mike could write a song by himself. Because I know that there's, I'm sure you've heard it. Mike Love would be nothing if it wasn't for Brian Wilson. But this shows that he has some talent on himself, by himself, on his own. And I also really like Funky Pretty as well, like you mentioned with like the Me and My Pisces. That's actually my favorite line in that song too, Pisces Lady. But yeah, definitely, I would say Big Sur is a big highlight on this album. And then he also does a pretty good job on the California Saga California, with the throwback to Cool, Cool Water and everything. He sings that very well.
Yeah, that one is really cool because it's definitely like a 1970s follow-up of California Girls.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike delivers a really similar kind of lead vocal sound on that one. Yeah, you guys summed up, I think, his contributions on Holland perfectly. So, following Carl and the Passions and Holland not being very successful, the band was sort of at a crossroads for what to do. And coincidentally, around this time with George Lucas's American Graffiti movie and just the general sentiment in the country, people were starting to feel really nostalgic for the early 60s. And at least musically, no one represented those times more than the Beach Boys. So the band found out that Capitol intended on releasing a compilation of their material that went up to 1965, as that was the stuff that Capitol still had the rights to. And before it could get very far, Mike made sure to go down to Capitol and see it through that the package would reflect something that the band approved of and that fit with their iconography. So Mike created the track list for the songs and how they should all play together, as well as the concept for the album and for the promotion with the whole Endless Summer, which was inspired by a 60s surf movie. And it just really elevated the package from yet another compilation into basically an iconic sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a statement from the band, like this is us, this is who we are for the ages, basically. In 200 years, people will probably still listen to Endless Summer. And it was just the perfect way to put all those songs together in a way that sort of made the entire package, all those songs benefit from the way that they fit together on the album. And it sort of elevates those songs into something greater because it paints this whole California dream when you listen to the different, the album goes through surfing songs, and then the kind of school and girl songs, and the car songs. And it just really takes you through the different eras of the band's early days and just paints this amazing picture of California and of the Beach Boys that was so timeless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something I wanted to mention about this whole period when, Endless Summer comes out, obviously becomes a massive success, top of the charts, and really changes the trajectory of the band. And I know a lot of people kind of, blame Mike and say like, oh, well, ever since Endless Summer, like Mike kind of leaned into like the oldies and it's kind of his fault while Carl wanted to do the newer material. But the reality is, again, like you put yourself in Mike's shoes and When you're playing to thousands of people every night and you hear the crowd reacting to all these amazing old songs that you wrote, and absolutely like going nuts. And then when you play the newer material and they come off a bit, colder and they're not as interested. I mean, it's hard not to blame him in the situation that they were in. Like you don't want to deal with these annoying crowds that are giving you a hard time and just wanted to hear the oldies. And the band had such a deep catalog of oldies to play, where like I can kind of understand, like, the public kind of, like it or not, the public really did speak at the time in terms of what they wanted to hear. Obviously, there were people that wish that the band would have gone in a more progressive direction. I personally wish they had done some more albums like Holland and Carl and the Passions. I would have liked to have heard more of that style from them. But at the same time, I don't blame Mike for leaning more into the commercial side of things. I get it. Music again for Mike was really all there was for him. And I understand leaning into, what's going to bring you the most success and what's going to sell the most tickets. So, again, like you said, some people are kind of critical of Mike for having a more business minded approach, but you also have to remember, how he grew up and why he has that mindset. This music was really his life. And so for that reason, I do understand it, as frustrating as it is sometimes that the band leaned so hard into nostalgia kind of from this point on. But
I think sometimes it almost gives the band maybe a little too much credit, to say that they always were completely cognizant of like the directions that they were pivoting to.
mm-hmm.
Like, okay, now we're going to be a progressive band. Now we're going to be an oldies band.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it was just that they wrote and they created what they were feeling at the time and what sort of reflected the times. And I think with the early 70s, they were taking a lot of drugs and they were meditating. So the early 70s stuff is obviously going to reflect that. But by the middle of the 70s, they're playing stadiums again, and there's the whole wave of nostalgia. So I think it was just natural that the music they would make from that point on would just reflect that. They were always writing stuff that reflected their lives. So, you sort of have the whole momentum of Endless Summer sort of create the wave that would be 15 Big Ones.
Mm-hmm.
And the album that the band named after Mike, Love You. I don't think they actually did that on purpose, but you could obviously make the argument that maybe they did. But yeah, like, those albums obviously have a lot of nostalgia, and, these were largely songs that Brian was writing, but Mike's vocals give it a lot of that nostalgic sort of feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're talking about stuff like rock and roll music or, Blueberry Hill and, but then also Let Us Go On This Way and Love Is a Woman.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Mike's, very still Beach Boys sounding vocals as one of the hallmarks of, as you can see, they're taking this Endless Summer momentum and Mike's sort of bringing that into their new albums, kind of returning to that classic Beach Boy vocal sound, at least in terms of Mike's delivery.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, in a way, like, yeah, Mike's vocal kind of represented like the band of old, because at that point, Brian's voice was not sounding good. It was very rough from all the years of abuse. Dennis was pretty much the same way. And even Carl doesn't always sound like the absolute best on some of these tracks as well. But yeah, Mike is still clearly recognizably Mike, and he delivers a lot of really great vocals on those albums that you mentioned. So yeah, some of the highlights for me from this period of the band, from the 15 Big Ones, Love You era for Mike. It's Okay, I think, has an awesome lead from Mike. Really kicks off from the start. Just fun is in, it's no sin, it's that time again. Really great lead vocal there. And a really fun and catchy song. Hadophonia, love Mike's parts on that track as well during the verses. I think he sings it really great. A really smooth delivery from him on that one.
Yeah, that's a Mike co-write too.
Mike co-write, yep. And then moving on to Love You, quite a few Mike moments on here that I feel are worth a mention. First off, on Let Us Go On This Way, I absolutely love Mike's bridge. The seams we have, extrasensory perception, you can send me thoughts, I'd have no objection. I love his vocal delivery on that. Really cool sort of bridge section on that track. So I really like that a lot. Johnny Carson, I think, is actually a pretty underrated vocal from Mike. I don't hear too many people talk about that one as like a great Mike vocal, but re-listening to it recently, like, he really sings the hell out of that song. I especially love his line on the Ed McMahon comes on and says he is Johnny every night at 11:30. He's so funny. honey. Really love the way that he sings that. And really fits the Brian's kind of quirky lyrics well. Besides that, obviously, Ding Dang. Mike sings the verses. The girl, I love her so madly. I treat her so kind, but she treats me so badly. But really fun little verse there. And then, of course, I also have to mention Airplane, which is one of my favorite Mike vocals, period. I think he sings this song so beautifully. It's a cool kind of blend of like this really smooth vocal from Mike, kind of similar to a lot of his late 60s vocals and early 70s vocals. But then you've got this cool kind of like synth pop backing track in the background, which is pretty cool with the Moog synthesizers. So I really love Mike's vocal delivery on that. Like on the line, the houses, they look so tiny, the cars look like dots. Yeah, just a really great vocal delivery there. So yeah, Mike, I know a lot of people, kind of say like, I think Love You is another one of those albums where people might kind of assume like, oh, Mike was probably against this because it's just a very uncommercial album. But again, if you listen to like some of those demo recordings of Brian bashing these songs out on the piano, you can hear Mike in the background and he sounds really impressed, especially on I'll Bet He's Nice, where he says at the end, I think he's like, that was a motherfucker or something like that. So obviously he was still very supportive of Brian at the time, and he had faith in these songs. Unfortunately, the album wasn't a huge success commercially, and I can understand why, is how quirky it was, both lyrically and production wise. But I really don't think Mike was against it by any means. I think it was once this album struggled a bit commercially, I think that was kind of like the writing on the wall. Like, okay, we need to kind of go back to basics, which is what you saw with like MIU and some of the albums that followed. But some great contributions from Mike on Love You. So Matt, any thoughts on some of Mike's Love You contributions?
Yeah, I agree. The bridge on Let Us Go On This Way is really good. And that song is a Mike co-write. I believe that's the only Brian Mike co-write on Love You. Yeah. Roller Skating Child, I do think he sings it well, albeit his lyrics are just, yeah, they're not great. And I totally agree with Airplane. And then Love Is a Woman, he has a pretty nice part. I actually like his vocal on Love Is a Woman better than Brian.
Me too, 100%.
Yeah. Brian just does not sound good on that song.
Love Is a Woman.
Airplane definitely is probably the highlight for me of Mike on Love You. That is a really, really good song.
Yeah. All right, so then after that, we move on to the MIU album. This was a point where there was a lot of tension going on in the band. A lot of the members were fighting. You kind of had two separate factions of the band. You had I believe they kind of refer to it as like the TMers, where you had like Mike and Al on one side, and then you had Brian, Carl, and Dennis on the other side. So there was a lot of tension going on within the group, a lot of inner fighting. The band almost broke up a couple times during this period. But anyway, the band went to Maharishi International University in, I believe, Fairfield, Iowa, to record the MIU album. And Brian and Mike got back together to write some songs on this album. I believe over half the tracks in here are Brian and Mike co-writes. In terms of some of the highlights for me, She's Got Rhythm. I really love Mike's quiet vocal part during she came to my table, we both ordered something to eat, and then the something to eat. Always like that part a lot. Probably my favorite part of that song. Pitter Patter is a Mike and Al co-write that I really like a lot. I love Mike's vocal on the verses of this song, and I just think it's a really catchy melody. Really shows kind of the strength of Mike and Al as a songwriting partnership. I think they actually wrote quite a few great songs. I think Brian actually is credited on that one as well, so I don't want to leave that out. Match Point of Our Love, one of my favorite songs from MIU. Some interesting lyrics from Mike with the early in the game when you broke me just like a serve. I know Matt loves that one. And then So We Volleyed a While with Small Talk and a Smile, and As Push Comes to Shove. So some pretty cheesy tennis metaphors on there, but I do really like the song, despite the kind of cheesy lyrics that I assume were written by Mike. And then lastly, I wanted to mention Winds of Change. I know that, on this podcast, a lot of us aren't a fan of this one. I will stand up for it, even though it's not my favorite. On the album, I do think it's a pretty track. And I actually think Mike's part is one of the most moving parts of this song. I am no stranger to a world of change. I find that part very moving. I think Mike sings that really well. So, yeah, MIU, definitely a spotty effort for sure. But there are some nice contributions from Mike on here. And really, I think Mike kind of played a role in getting this album done. I know Al is kind of listed as like the main producer for this record, but I know Mike was one of the most involved members in this album's recording, because I know a lot of the other members, like Carl and Dennis, were kind of away for a lot of the time that this album was being recorded. So thought that was worth mentioning as well.
Another song I like that Mike did was Won't You Come Out Tonight. I think that's a really nice song, and I think he sings
Yeah.
it well. And they also, Brian and Mike co-wrote Sweet Sunday Kind of Love, which
Mhm.
an amazing job on. So those are the two songs I wanted to give a highlight to on MIU. And yes, I'm not a Winds of Change fan, so
Yeah, our conversation about this album that we did a few weeks or months ago really actually made me appreciate this album a lot more. And so, clearly Mike was a big part of this album. And I've always really liked Kona Coast, and I like Mike's parts on Come Go With Me too.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
yeah,
that's a very well done cover. Come Go With Me.
yeah, the more I listen to it and the more I just sort of soak up that album, it definitely sort of reminds me of like a late 70s Sunflower in a way, just like sort of that mellow, sort of soft rock Beach Boys kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do understand the direction that I think Mike was trying to go with this album, but one thing I will say is that it's still like slightly confused, because half the songs have that kind of surf 50s nostalgia thing going on, and then half the songs are still very experimental and creative. And yeah, maybe it could have just even benefited from a different track listing or something
Yeah.
like that.
One other track I wanted to mention that was released around this time that I really like, that was a Mike co-write, Almost Summer, which I believe
Totally.
alongside Brian. That's a really fun track. I believe it was recorded under the Celebration name, Mike's kind of offshoot band at the time. Of course, I know Matt loves the opening lyric, the Susie wants to be a lady director, but it is a fun vocal from Mike, fun lyrics. And I also love in the American Bandstand performance of this song, when they get to the line, giving the teacher dirty looks, and Mike does like jazz hands. I always laugh at that. It's very funny, like Mike moment there, very like cheesy 70s Mike moment. But yeah, it's a really fun song. I can see why I believe it was a top 30 hit at the time. So
There's another great celebration tune that Mike wrote called Sad, Sad Summer,
mhm.
from that same album. Really, really gorgeous song. I think one of the best songs that Mike wrote on his own for sure.
And then speaking of songs that Mike wrote on his own, on the band's next album, LA Light album from 1979, Mike contributed the song Sumahama, which actually I really like this track a lot. I know there's some people that slag this one off. I think it's mostly because of the Japanese lyrics during the third or fourth verse. I probably could have done without that, but honestly, I think the melody is really beautiful. I think Mike's vocal is really nice, and I think the production is really great as well. I think it's a very pretty track, and I think it's one of Mike's stronger solo contributions to a Beach Boys album. So I really like that track a lot, and it's one that I've really grown to appreciate over time. So just wanted to mention that one.
Yeah, I really like Sumahama too. That's probably I do like that song. And then as far as the Japanese goes, yeah, not a fan of that, but I think that the production is really pretty, and the first half of the song is really nice. It's just the Japanese comes in and the song kind of goes a little bit cringe for me, but I do think Mike is a great vocal.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike has a light footprint on LA because he was working really hard on a couple solo albums at this time, which those albums have some really good stuff too, like First Love,
First Love,
Too
yeah.
Cruel, Daybreak Over the Ocean, which would
Yeah.
eventually become a Beach Boys song. So yeah, the White Album is definitely like the White Album by the Beatles, and that it's like the different camps sort of making their own tracks. So even Mike's vocals are not on every song on LA, but I think Sumahama is a really strong contribution. I always sort of go back and forth on the Japanese section. I think it sounds nice, but I'd rather have it be something that I could understand and sing along to. But it's a really cool song, and it by no means ruins that song for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And then going to another standalone track that was released around this time, that was a Mike co-write, It's a Beautiful Day, which was co-written by, again, Al and Mike, another Mike and Al collaboration. I've always really liked the song a lot. I don't see it get discussed too much among like Beach Boys fans. But I think it's a lot of fun, has great energy to it. I love Carl's vocals on the chorus, and I love Mike and Al's verses or vocals during the verses. So really fun little track there. Again, kind of like leaning into like, the nostalgia kind of throwback sound, but I really like it a lot. I think it's fun.
Yeah, to me, that song definitely reminds you, like, oh yeah, these are the same guys that made I Get Around and Fun, Fun, Fun. Like, it sounds like
Yeah, right.
definitely like those same guys that made those earlier songs. It definitely has a lot of that early 60s Beach Boys sound to it.
Yep.
And that sort of segues in really smoothly to Keeping the Summer Alive, which Mike had like a really heavy hand in the songwriting on that album.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so keeping the summer alive, like Nate mentioned, Brian and Mike wrote a lot of these songs together. It's definitely an album that's pretty divisive. I know a lot of fans aren't a big fan of it. For me, I think quite a bit of the material is actually pretty decent, but the production holds a lot of it back. But overall, it's not a horrible listen, just not one of the band's strongest albums by any means. In terms of Mike's highlights on here, I really like his bridge section on "Oh Darlin'." Like the "lying here with you in the night." I've always really liked that part from Mike. His vocals on "Some of Your Love" are a lot of fun. I think he sings a great lead on that one. His vocals on the verses of "Going On" are great. And the one song I hate to bring this up is it's kind of a more negative thing, but on Santa Ana Winds, I wish that Mike had sung his parts a little differently on that because he sounds way too nasally on that in particular. I know that you've even said, Nate, as a big Mike fan, that one really tests your limit of
Yeah, I'm
Mike.
with you on that.
But yeah, that's a really great song anyway. I just wish the production and Mike's vocals were done a little bit differently. But yeah, overall, this album, Keeping the Summer Alive, not the band's strongest by any means. And there definitely are some forgettable tracks on it, but I think it had the potential to actually be a pretty decent record, just held back a bit by its production and just kind of the slick sound of it. So, Nate, any other thoughts on Keeping the Summer Alive?
Yeah, I'd say Going On is one of the true, one of the last to also like great Wilson Love co-writes. I think that's just a really great song lyrically and musically. I'm a big fan of some of the lighter songs on this album too, like Some of Your Love and Sunshine. I think are both fun, and Mike contributed to both of those. So yeah, this album is sort of really the beginning of the band truly sort of sounding like an oldies act. But I don't see like too much wrong with that because they were. And and I do think that the songwriting is really strong on this album. Like I think you could say that the production is lacking. Um, you could say this or that, but I do think a lot of the songs are really strong. But yeah, I guess I would particularly single out Going On as just a great Mike lyric for sure.
All right, so then after Keeping Summer Alive, we get Mike's solo album, Looking Back with Love, from 1981. I don't have too much to say about this one, but I do really like the title track, Looking Back with Love. I think it's a fun song, kind of like nostalgic lyrics, looking back at all the different events that occurred since like the 50s and 60s. And I think Mike's vocal on it is very nice. Also, I hate that I like this track, but Teach Me Tonight, I actually really like the production on it. And I think Mike's vocal is pretty good. As cringy as it might be hearing Mike sing some of those lyrics, I do think it's a nicely produced song. So I do like that one quite a bit. Matt, any thoughts on Looking Back with Love?
I actually listened to it earlier today. It's fine. Honestly, like I'll be honest, it was not as bad as I thought it was gonna be. I expected
Yeah.
way worse. But it's just kind of okay for me. Like I think it kind of suffers from the same problem that Keep the Summer Alive has, where it's just not really that to me, it's just not really that interesting. It's just like a lot of kind of like samey sounding. It kind of just treat of past material, but it's well sung, I guess.
Yeah.
So I was expecting a catastrophe when I was gonna listen to it, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it was gonna be.
No, I wouldn't say it's a bad album by any means. I think there's some nice moments on it. But like you said, kind of, yeah, it's not the most memorable. It does kind of start to feel a little bit samey. And there definitely are some kind of cringy lyrics with like "Rockin' the Man in the Boat" and some of those songs. But yeah, overall, not a bad listen, just not super memorable. So.
Yeah. Some of the songs it just sounds like he's like singing like still singing like teenage stuff and he's like 40, so it just like kind of feels
Well, that's kind of like the issue with like "Teach Me Tonight," like the lyrics, like I wish he wasn't singing the lyrics that he's singing, but I actually do like his vocal delivery on it. So
yeah, no, it was well sung. It was just kind of strange. That's all.
yeah, right. So then in 1985, the band releases Beach Boy self-titled, or Beach Boys 85, as a lot of fans refer to it. Mike has some nice moments on this album. I will say for me, this is the period he starts to get a little nasally for my liking. You can definitely hear like on Get You Back. I do like Mike's vocal, but it definitely is starting to get to the point where it definitely is like noticeably more nasally than it was only like 5 or 6 years prior. But I do think it's a good vocal from Mike, and I do think the lyrics are good as well. Also, I wanted to mention the track. I know Matt's not a huge fan of this one, but Male Ego. I actually really like Mike's vocals. The words, yeah, they're pretty cheesy and pretty cringy. I can see where Matt's issue lies with those, but I do actually like Mike's vocal delivery. I like the way that he sings it. So, yeah, overall, yeah, 85. I wouldn't say it's like Mike's strongest contributions in terms of vocals, but still some really enjoyable moments on there. So.
But yeah, I agree. For me, Get You Back is probably Mike's highlight on here. Great job with writing, great job singing it, great job performing it. Otherwise, I know this isn't like a super Mike heavy album. He's got vocals on California Calling.
Yeah, and that's California Calling is another one where very nasally, very, very nasally.
I think this was the start of around this time is when he starts really getting into the stuff, like mid 80s. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You hear the start of that on Keeping the Summer Alive, and then by this point, like it's definitely in like full fledged the nasal. So
yeah, I think as a whole, Beach Boys 85 is an album that is a lot better than it has any right to be. I mean, it's clearly like a bit of like, well, no, it's not really an oldies one because they work with Steve Levine and stuff. So like
yeah,
for a band that had been around for 25 years, or yeah, about 25 years at this point in time, like there's a lot better than it has any right to be, honestly.
Yeah, I'd say with the albums, usually Mike filled one of two roles. He usually either filled the roles of like one of the leaders of the albums, like writing most of the songs and singing most of the songs, like, Wild Honey or Today. Or there were other albums where he was really much more of like a team player, like Smile or this album, where he's contributing backing vocals to nearly all the songs, if not all the songs, but isn't necessarily doing a whole lot of leads or writing. But that's cool because, Mike's a really great harmony singer and bass vocalist, and his contributions to the harmonies on this album is part of what makes them so slick and so recognizably Beach Boys.
All right, Nate. So do you want to lead us into kind of Kokomo and how that came together with Mike and John Phillips and that whole crew, Terry Melcher?
Yeah, so it is a bit of a convoluted story, but so basically they were making that Tom Cruise movie Cocktail, which I think was produced by one of Disney's subsidiary companies that made movies for adults. And the Beach Boys were approached to do a song on the soundtrack. And by this point, Bruce had brought Terry Melcher into the fold, sort of as a surrogate Brian of sorts, someone to write and arrange and produce. And, through the publishing grapevine, they got their hands on a John Phillips demo. And Mike and Terry and this guy named Scott McKenzie, as well as Bruce, who sort of went uncredited, rewrote the song and reproduced it into something completely new. And, combined with the success of the movie starring Tom Cruise, who, obviously go on to be a movie star, as well as the music video they filmed with John Stamos at Disney World, there was just so many things going on with this song, aside from it being a really killer song, that made it such a phenomenon. And it, ultimately became the biggest hit of the band's career, metrically speaking. And it did totally set a new chapter where Mike was, given more power than he ever had, more or less, and really took the band in a different direction from here on out. But a really triumphant moment for the band. And I really wholeheartedly believe the song would have never, it's a pretty song the way that John Phillips wrote it, but it wouldn't have been that huge smash hit without Mike's lyrics and hook and vocal delivery.
Yeah. It's got that Mike Love magic for sure.
Yeah.
catchy chorus, the catchy hook, the very catchy lyrics, the way it kind of rhymes. It's a fun track. You can see why it was a massive hit for the band. So.
And I think it just draws you. And I know that was Mike's idea to open with the Aruba, Jamaica. Like it's kind of like what you mentioned, Nate, about I Get Around earlier in the episode, where like it kind of draws you in. I think the same is true with Kokomo. The opening with like the naming of these like exotic locales kind of draws you into the song.
Yep. So yeah, obviously that was a massive hit for the band, and like Nate said, kind of gave Mike some more control of the band's direction at that point, with it being their first number one hit since, I believe, Good Vibrations, right? So so then in 1980, I believe 1989, the album Still Cruisin' comes out, which is kind of a hodgepodge collection of like movie soundtrack songs that the band had recorded, as well as a couple of extra miscellaneous tracks and then a few oldies as well. In terms of Mike's contributions to this album, Still Cruisin'.
Really solid contributions on this album.
Yes. Still Cruisin'. I like Mike's vocal, even though the lyrics are very cheesy, like the "Hey girl, let's go for a spin, hop in my hot rod and do it again." Like, it's such a Mike lyric there, but it is a fun song. I do enjoy it quite a bit. I like the production on it as well. Make It Big. I really like Mike's vocal part, like the "baby, you're a superstar, looking like you're going far." I've always really liked that a lot too. So, some solid.
Somewhere Near Japan too,
Somewhere
which
Near
is
Japan is
a Mike co-write.
That's an amazing song. That's my favorite. That is it's such a well-written song. It's such a catchy pop song. And Mike does a pretty good job singing it too. Though I will say, I do think Al has the best vocal on that song, but Mike still did contribute a lot of the songwriting. And for that, I am thankful, because that is my favorite song on Still Cruisin'.
So then after Still Cruisin', the band, keeps on touring. And a few years later,
they keep on cruising.
They're still cruising after all these years. And then a few years later comes Summer in Paradise. So I'll be honest, I actually, as much shit as this album gets in terms of the production and just the general complaints that people make about like the cheesy lyrics and, oh my God, it's Mike Love leading the band, like this is an embarrassment. But I have to say, like, re-listening to this album recently, like, I actually like a lot of Mike's moments on this album. Like, I think his vocals are very good for the most part. I think on the song Still Surfing, I think Mike delivers a really solid lead vocal. I always laugh at the Surfer Joe line, but it is a nice song. Strange Things Happen has a really cool lyric and vocal from Mike, like with the "She believes in God and karma too." That's a cool track. Lahaina Aloha, I love Mike's vocals on the verses, and then of course Carl on the chorus. And then even like Under the Boardwalk, which I've seen some people complain about as being kind of like a crappy cover. I actually do like Mike's vocal on it, and I like kind of the smooth production of it. So, there's some nice moments from Mike on here, some nice songwriting efforts from, I believe, him and Terry Melcher. And I think if this album had been produced better, I think it wouldn't have as negative as a response. That said, I don't think it would be a positive response necessarily, but I do think that a lot of the shit this album gets has more to do with the production than anything. So
it hasn't clicked for me. Sorry. I think it's kind of crap.
No, I don't think it's great, but like, I do think there's enjoyable moments. And I think some of these songs, like Still Surfing and Lahaina Aloha, I think are pretty enjoyable tracks. And
I just think the production is so bad on it. It really, it's just kills.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. I kind of see why when that person ranked all the Train records that Todd and the Shadows covered, they put this in the F tier. It's just
Nate.
Yeah, so I've grown to love this album, and like most fans, I wasn't a huge fan for the first few years of me knowing about it or hearing it, but just after a long time, it grew on me. I think there are like a lot of nice originals. There's nothing that's gonna blow your mind like All I Want to Do or Sail on Sailor, but to me, Summer in Paradise does sound like the Beach Boys in their 40s and 50s, and they're dads now, and they're not as cool as they were when they were young, but it sort of has its own like unique charm in itself. Like if Surfin' USA and Surfer Girl is the sound of a bunch of teenagers going to the beach, Summer in Paradise is kind of like the sound of a bunch of dads having a cookout. And it is what it is, and it's fun. But I do love, as far as Mike's songwriting goes, Lahaina Aloha and Strange Things Happen are really, really well written songs. And I can't say the same about Summer in Paradise being really, really well written as a song, but I do really enjoy it and I do find myself humming it a lot. And yeah, I think, it may have been a little ham-fisted, but you got to give credit for the Beach Boys sticking to their guns about helping the environment and all that. Um, it kind of shows that they weren't doing it truly just as like a fad with the Surf's Up era stuff, that it is actually something that they cared about and would continue to write about. So I'm going in circles to basically say I enjoy the album for what it is.
Yeah. I know Matt loves the lyrics on the title track.
Something about those lyrics, man. I get what they're going for, but yeah, too ham-fisted for me.
We came out rocking with Rhonda and Barbara Ann.
Yeah.
So yeah, like Nate said, definitely some solid song contributions from Mike. Nothing mind blowing, but some nice songs. And if the production was better, I think this would be a more listenable album for sure. So then after this album comes out, a lot happens within the band's history. Carl obviously passes away a few years later in 1998 from cancer. But the band keeps on going. Mike and Bruce, this is around the time when Mike and Bruce kind of become like the touring Beach Boys. And they continue to tour, playing at like fairs and different events across the US. But then, of course, in 2012, the band gets back together. The surviving members, I should say, get back together to put out their 29th and final studio album. That's Why God Made the Radio. On this album, there's some nice contributions from Mike. I especially like Daybreak Over the Ocean. I think Mike delivers a really nice, smooth vocal on that track. Very pretty song. And then on From There to Back Again, I like Mike's contribution at the end, like the ba-da-da, ba-da-ba-ba-ba-da. I think that was a nice little use of his voice there. So, not too much to say about Mike's contributions to this album. I will say not the biggest fan of Beaches in Mind. I know that was a Mike song that he contributed. Never been a favorite of mine, but there's some nice moments on here from Mike, and I think it's all in all, it's a decent 50th anniversary album, if not a little bit slickly produced. So
yeah, it has.
He wasn't really allowed to contribute as much as he wanted to. That's always been his big gripe with this era, is that he wanted to write a lot more songs than he was allowed to. They kind of threw him his bone and then wouldn't let him.
Yeah.
So it would have been interesting to hear if what it could have sounded like if they let him and Brian just sort of get in front of the piano like Mike was wanting.
Yeah. And I think the other problem that I have with this record is, like you said, there's some pleasant moments, but it's a bit too auto-tuned for me. Like a lot of auto-tune. I don't know what Joe Thomas was thinking. And just to compare it, like I listened to David Bowie's Black Star not too long ago for the first time, and that is just so much better produced. I mean, it's just night and freaking day. So it's just like, I think like they really could have done a bit better with the production. I'm just not a fan of how it was produced.
Yeah, I get that.
As far as this one, I'd say Daybreak Over the Ocean is a really strong song, and I'm glad that it is in the Beach Boys canon. And I also like Mike's contributions on Spring Vacation and Isn't It Time, as far as his songwriting goes.
Yeah.
But I guess one thing I'd really like to address too is you sort of included it in there, but moved past, was how the Beach Boys became, the Mike and Bruce band, as people say.
Yeah.
But one thing I'd love to emphasize, like with this episode, and sort of set the record straight, is I think far too many people have the perception that it's the Mike Love version of the band, or that it's, people will say like, oh, it's just a solo act with the sidemen, or whatever accusation people want to throw at the band or they'll call it a cover band or all these different things. But it really truly was a very smooth transition as the 90s came to a close. Obviously, Brian had his solo career happening, and he was kind of freshly freed from Landy and married to Melinda, doing a solo act thing. And when Carl, so Carl passed away. So obviously he's not going to be in the band anymore. And with Al Al sort of thought that the writing was on the wall when Carl passed away, and he sort of voluntarily left the band because he thought it was over. So what you're left with was Mike and Bruce, and they're touring guys. And when Mike started touring with Bruce as, the Beach Boys in 1998, it was entirely made up of musicians that Carl handpicked and Carl auditioned, like Mike Miros on the organ and Mike Kowalski and Adrian Baker and all these guys. Carl had been present for the auditions and they were like vetted by Carl. So obviously that lineup changed a lot over the last 26 years, but it originally started as something that Carl was approving of and that Carl's estate has always approved of.
Yeah.
And it really is truly the continuation of the Beach Boys and not like a side act rodeo fair thing that people make it out to be. And so I think we just totally have Mike to thank for that the Beach Boys could have ended in 1998 and that could have been truly the end of the story. But thanks to his dedication, we've had an extra 26 years of our favorite band, and that can't go undervalued.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, regardless of your view on, the legitimacy of the Mike and Bruce, Mike and Bruce touring under the Beach Boys name, I think, it's important to remember that, like, these guys are in their 80s now. And, it's been so many years now since Carl passed. And the fact that they're still going and really carrying on the band's legacy, kind of like you said, Nate, like, obviously Al still tours as well, but now with Brian being off the road, really like Mike and Bruce are really kind of carrying on the band's music to new generations of fans. And I really respect them for keeping at it after all these years and really keeping the band's music alive. And I think that, especially as the members have gotten older, I think it's more important now than ever to catch them while you still can and just appreciate the music. And yeah, I just think it's great that they're still out there, regardless of what you think of them touring under the Beach Boys name. So
yeah, and it's like Jake, that concert we saw on the 4th of July, there were between 20 and 30,000 people there.
yeah,
And everyone was having fun, everyone was singing along, there were no fights, there were no problems. And it's amazing that Mike, continues to bring that to people. And I, for one, know that they do well, they do okay, but it's not like Mike's current touring operation makes millions and bajillions of dollars.
right,
They're a pretty like economic business or faction, like
Yeah.
they they care about the bottom line, but they're not bringing in a hell of a lot of money. So you can't just say, oh, Mike's just doing it for the money. And anyone that asks Mike why he continues to do this, it's because he really cares and now more than ever can see all the happiness that this music brings people, and he truly feels like it's his calling or it's his purpose to
yeah,
continue to bring that to people, and it's really beautiful.
Doesn't
yeah,
he? Doesn't he pay a pretty hefty licensing fee to use the name too? So like that
Exactly.
further is why you can't really say, oh, it's just for money, because probably the take home when all is said and done is probably fairly slim.
Exactly. And it's really about like the first 17% of everything that they make goes directly to Brian, the shareholders. So they have to run such an efficient operation. And that's part of why they play so many dates, is it's only profitable if they do 150 shows or something like that. And it's really for the love of bringing it to people and, not to add any zeros to their bank account, because they could go about it in a much more lucrative way if it was about the money. If it was about the money, I think Mike would just play 15 stadiums a year like McCartney and call it a day. But instead, he'd rather be out there for the majority of the year. And if that takes playing fairs or private birthday parties, he'll do it, And I
yeah,
think that's really neat.
This is
Like,
not Eras tour, where it's like you're playing these big stadiums like
yeah,
3 or 4 nights, and then it's like packed to the gills.
Riley has said something before that Mike is like sort of like the everyman of the rock and roll or of the Beach Boys. And I think Mike's methods of touring very much so reflect that. He could be like a bougie rock star that played just the stadiums for the rich people for a couple days a year. But instead, he likes to get out there for all the average, everyday Americans in small towns or around people around the world who might not have the money to see a lot of other big stars. And so he'll play these small festivals or small state fairs so that people with, not a lot of ability to see some of their favorite bands get to still see the Beach Boys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I also want to mention too, before we wrap up, that Mike has had a really great reputation of being really great with the fans. Especially over the past, couple decades. I know, like, when I saw Mike and Bruce at the Chicago Theater a few years ago, I brought with me a copy of Sunflower that I wanted to get signed. And after the show, or towards the end of the show, when they were playing Fun, 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 I held it up towards Mike, to get his attention. And sure enough, after the show ended, he came over and gladly signed it for me. And that's when I told him, I love your vocals on All I Want to Do on this album. And he said, thank you. And it was just a cool little interaction there, as quick as it was. It meant a lot to me that he signed that album for me. And it's something that I'll never forget, for sure. So,
and it's impressive that in his mid-70s, Mike went on a spurt of solo album releases, which is pretty unusual for someone his age. And, some of the songs are maybe not everyone's cup of tea, but I highly recommend our listeners listen to his 3 recent solo albums: Unleash the Love, Reason for the Season, and 12 Sides of Summer. Definitely good Beach Boys vibes, and cool to hear from a Mike in his mid-70s, someone that when he first started singing was a teenager. Hearing his output in his 70s is pretty neat.
Yeah. I did want to shout out the song Cool Head Warm Heart. I forget which album that's from. I'm sure
totally. Yeah, it's from this one, Unleash the Love, which
I think that's
signed for me. Yeah,
a really nice song from Mike. Really nice vocal and just a nice moving song. So
yeah, I listened to that one earlier today, and that was the one that was like, wow, this is actually pretty good. Because that was another one too that I put that on, I'm like, oh God help me. But no, there's
and here's the real treasure too.
We haven't even
the infamous, yeah.
Don't listen to that, folks. Don't listen to that.
All right, so our listeners, if you're watching this episode on YouTube, you probably noticed that Riley is not here with us tonight to record this episode, but he did send me a list of some notes that he wanted me to share with our audience before we wrap up. So I'm going to do that right now. So here is a bit of what Riley wrote. So, oh, Mike Love, Michael Edward Love, what could be said that hasn't been said? Egotistical, cheesy, bald, etc. Sure, he has a bit of an ego, but that could be said about a lot of rock stars. And to his credit, he wrote the lyrics to my favorite Beach Boys album and song, as well as a good portion of the band's hits. Ultimately, I think Mike's biggest downfall was the success of Kokomo. If it had not been released, he'd be remembered as a little bit of a dick, but not much more so than John Lennon, Johnny Rotten, Lyndon, or Morrissey. Yet Kokomo prevailed, and Mike won the war of commercialism versus artistry. Although that isn't to say nothing good came from it, I like to say I'm a fan of a good chunk of the Mike Love, Terry Melcher material, and I've often said their collaborations are a victim of dated production rather than general songwriting. Just because something is super commercial doesn't make it bad. Mike is also quite a good lyricist. I think it's funny that he has written some of the greatest lyrics in pop rock history and some of the worst. In terms of the good ones that Riley cited, he wrote the lyrics from Big Sur. He wrote, and so while stars shine brightly from up above, the fog rolls in through a redwood grove into my dying fire. I think I'll add a log. He also mentioned the pen is mightier than the sword, but no match for a gun, from Student Demonstration Time. And he said that that's a fucking bar. But then after that, he wrote, people all around the world in every nation like to get together for some excitation. If you're a girl who appreciates recreation, why don't you let me take you on a love vacation?
Love vacation.
So yeah, obviously a bit of a contrast there in the lyrics, but and then Riley said, as for Mike's voice, I see it ultimately as one of Brian's greatest tools. Compared to the angelic voices of Carl, Alan, Brian, Mike has the everyman quality to his voice. Call me crazy, but his bass harmony adds some humanity to the angelic voices from Al, Brian, and Carl. Mike, when he's at his best, can sing so earnestly. See All I Want to Do or Big Sur. And Mike also has such a talent for spitfire vocals on songs like Girl from New York City and All I Want to Do. He can even pull off some swag with his vocals on songs like California Girls. And he says that he's like the American Liam Gallagher, which of course, we know Riley loves Oasis. And then the last thing Riley wanted to mention is that one thing I think is ultimately forgotten with Mike is the way that he matches his lyrics with a rhythm. The cadence of his vocals and lyrics create such a flow and such a swag. The Beach Boys hits without the lyrical flow from Mike just aren't the same. Songs like Girl from New York City, California Girls, Here Today, 409, all have some fantastic vocal flow from Mike. It's easy to miss, but you won't unhear it when you notice it. And for me personally,
that is so well put. That is so well put.
And then lastly, for me personally, it has only been matched by Sean Ryder from Happy Mondays. So those are Riley's thoughts. If you have any additional thoughts to add to that, Nate or Matt.
Oh, I think you said it well. I think you said it very well, especially the part about matching the lyrics, the cadence of the voice with the lyrics and the rhythm of the song.
Yep.
It's so well put. And yeah, like 409, Fun, Almost Summer, like a lot of those songs have the perfect vocal rhythm in a way that's like how rappers are cognizant of creating flows in rap songs. Mike's like flows, for lack of better terms, are just so iconic,
Yeah, right.
Wow, that gave me a whole new appreciation that I was trying this whole episode to put my finger on what he put so beautifully there.
Thanks for that, Riley.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said.
All right, should we wrap it up there? Any closing thoughts?
I'm really glad. I think it's so easy for people that talk about the Beach Boys to get into this weird dog chasing its tail of being negative when talking about Mike's story or Mike's contributions. And I'm really happy that by and large, we were able to really put like a positive light on his long and, varied career.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I hope that through this, our listeners or whoever discovers this, show will not carry on that weird vilification of Mike and will just appreciate him for the great musician and businessman that he is.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, I think what helped me a lot was doing more research, and I would also say maybe me getting a little bit older, and because I was like 18 going on 19 when I got into this group, and now I'm 26. So like kind of getting older and kind of shifting my perspective a bit, and then kind of like putting myself in Mike's shoes, kind of realizing too that, this is a guy that had to deal with a lot of like mental illness and drug addiction in this band. And
yeah,
that is not easy to be around at all.
His band / family.
Yeah, and family too. And and anytime you mix family with business, that's always like really tough too. And I think also reading his book, honestly, kind of gave me a better perspective too. Some of the things that he wrote in that book were a little strange, but it definitely was cool to definitely hear his perspective on things and, kind of like hear him talk about like giving his side of the story. Because I really do think that in the rock press, they kind of like wrote a narrative that I think a lot of people when they're first getting into the band think of like, oh, everyone hates Mike Love, or most Beach Boys fans hate Mike Love, or Mike Love is the biggest dick in rock. And I'm sure you've heard that all before.
Yeah.
Right. But no, and that's kind of how I was when I first got into this band. But definitely like, with some time and, shifting perspectives and doing more research, I've kind of softened my stance a lot.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that because you guys know what a huge fan of Mike I am. And for me, also, really the turning point was reading his book. And for the first time, seeing it, the way things went down from his perspective instead of the way he was painted. And yeah, that was the big turning point for me as well, to really understanding his humanity and his own story,
Yeah. All right, so we'll wrap it up there. So thank you, everybody, for listening to this 33rd episode of Good Timin. I hope you all enjoyed the show. I had a great time discussing all things Dr. Love with you guys, and I'm looking forward to doing more member spotlight episodes in the near future. So as always, if you like this podcast and want to hear more, feel free to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening. We greatly appreciate the support as it motivates us to make more episodes in the future. And also, as a reminder, the Good Timin podcast is available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So there's plenty of different places to listen and keep up with the show. So thank you again, everybody, for listening, and we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.